keep this vibrant thing going. As Charlie will tell us today, it's these sort of networks that are key to driving innovation, and especially in times when we can't interact so much, all the more important that we get together in this type of forum. Anne tells me there's another way to fame, and that is to write a blog about Charlie's talk. So if you like what you're hearing, do write about it, and Anne will post it on the Oxford Energy website, energy.ox.ac.uk. We'd be ever so grateful for you to do it, and I'm sure there'll be rich pickings in Charlie's talk today. Charlie and I talked about introductions, and he suggested I go for the brief version, which is, welcome Charlie from the Tyndall Centre. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope this works. So are you now looking at my first slide? Phil, I can see you. Can you give me the thumb? Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So there's a lovely symmetry actually for me giving this talk today, because the first ever talk I think I gave about this project was when I was a visiting researcher briefly at the Environmental Change Institute with Nick, Phil and others. That was before the project really had started, and this is now as the project is coming to an end. Yeah, it's a nice opportunity. So as Phil mentioned, I'm talking about diffusion, and the backdrop to this is a statement of the obvious. Life is becoming increasingly digital. This map shows the proportion of daily internet users among 16 to 74-year-olds in the EU, and the dark red regions have over 90% of people in that age bracket using the internet daily, and actually England in particular is among the highest, if not the highest, in Europe with the Nordic countries. And it's a statement of the obvious to say that smartphones and other digital tech are becoming absolutely ubiquitous. So with that backdrop, I'm interested in whether certain digital consumer innovations can have beneficial impacts for climate change, and if so, how they spread or how they diffuse. So this is the basic structure of what I want to talk about. Okay, so just to sort of set the scene around digitalization and climate change, there are loads and loads of sort of weighty reports coming from different global bodies emphasizing the importance of these intertwined trends between digitalization and climate change. But the analysis, as I see it, tends to focus on the role of digitalization in the energy supply, the role of digitalization in how energy networks and energy infrastructure works and can be more efficient, and then particularly the impacts of digitalization on employment and the sorts of effects that has socially. But it's still highly uncertain what the overall intertwining of digitalization and climate change will look like. You frequently see these reports talking about potential heaven or hell, utopia or dystopia, if we don't steer digitalization in a socially beneficial way. But I'm interested in a particular bit of the digital story, and that is consumer innovations which can potentially help reduce emissions. And there's five, or at least five ways in which they can do this. So the first is that they potentially enable a shift from owning goods to accessing services. And this is enabled by real-time flows of information which allow surplus supply to be matched with demand in close to real time. So some examples to do with mobility are car clubs, ride sharing or shared ride hailing, or shared ride sourcing, which are all examples of this kind of service-based model. Related to these real-time information flows on supply and demand is the capacity for digital innovations to help increase the utilization of physical goods and also reduce waste. So some example, a mobility example would be peer-to-peer car sharing. A food example would be 11th hour apps, which allow consumers to find surplus food that would otherwise be thrown away by cafes or supermarkets, and also peer-to-peer electricity, whereby people with their own generation and storage systems can trade locally or on local networks with other users who have demand. Another way in which digital consumer innovations can reduce emissions is possibly the most obvious, and we're all experiencing it right now, in that digital can substitute for physical movement. So teleworking and video conferencing are very obvious, salient examples right now. But there's many others of particularly related to e-commerce, where potentially efficiently designed e-commerce systems can substitute for lots of physical movement in cars on roads as we go shopping. So two examples from food would be digital food hubs, which are basically like local farmers markets, but online rather than in a place. And also meal kits or recipe boxes. So you may be familiar with brands like HelloFresh or Gusto. And there is some evidence that the foregone or the avoided travel of people to shops in cars results in net carbon benefits. The fourth way in which digital consumer goods and services can help is by improving our ability to control and manage our use of energy. And this is often coupled with the strong trend towards electrifying end use as a way of helping decarbonize. So smart devices in the home offer this control functionality, and also it's a bit of a stretch calling electric vehicles and e-bikes digital technologies, but they do have, especially electric vehicles do have strong software components to do with the efficiency and operation of the hardware. And then finally, digital technologies are becoming increasingly important as energy systems decentralize. And there is an increasing need to coordinate activity across many different distributed supply resources, but also distributed loads or demand. So things like smart home appliances, which could potentially be controllable by utilities seeking to reduce demand for brief periods to avoid supply crunches, or things like PV and domestic storage, an electric vehicle to grid, whereby utilities can draw on batteries and electric vehicles as a distributed resource, all enabled by digitalization. And if you put all these together, here are all the different innovations I've introduced. If you put them all together, there's also something which I find in a way more interesting, which is that they in different ways represent challenges to mainstream norms of consumption. So if you think about the mobility innovations, they're all alternatives to us driving our fossil fueled vehicles with generally quite low frequency rates. If you look at the food innovations, they're all alternatives to us doing big provisioning shops in supermarkets. And if you look at the homes and the energy innovations at the bottom, they're all kind of alternatives to this consumption norm, essentially, of using energy however and whenever we need it, subject to obvious kind of constraints, particularly in fuel poor households or energy poor households. Now, we've done some work where we've looked at literature quantifying the emission reduction benefits from all these innovations, and I'm happy to either talk about this or come back to this at the end if people are interested. Okay, so that's the first bit, just to set the scene. And now I want to talk more about, well, if these innovations have these potential climate benefits, then that will only be realized if they spread through populations of potential adopters. So how do new things spread? Well, we've known about this for at least 70 or 80 years, going back to the 1940s, when some rural sociologists in Iowa in the US worked out why some farmers were using this innovative new seed corn and others weren't. And that's kind of led on to this huge body of literature that's been really nicely synthesized in a book called Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers. The last edition was in 2003, and sadly he died the year after that. But Rogers's kind of key insight was that diffusion is essentially a social process. He defined it as the communication over time about an innovation among members of a social system, so a fundamentally social process. And this kind of world of diffusion research has generated some terms I'm sure you're familiar with, like tipping points and early adopters and S-curves or logistic curves, and we'll come back to some of those in a moment. However, if I'd been doing this talk a year ago, I probably would have gone into more depth or background as to the basics of diffusion. But sadly, because of what's happened with coronavirus, we've all sort of learned by watching the media and listening to what's going on, and the explanation has been what's going on with the virus. We've learned all about diffusion because the basic mechanisms of how innovation spread are similar or analogous to the basic mechanisms of how the virus spreads. And there are four key mechanisms which I think we will all be familiar with now with respect to coronavirus. So the first is a statement of the obvious, that people are different. But specifically when it comes to virus transmission, we have varying susceptibilities to infection and varying potential for spreading. And this has been linked to things like age, profession, and risk behaviors. Interpersonal transmission is clearly absolutely critical. Infection happens through social contact, the exchange of the virus between people. We've learned that social networks are critically important. So the number, the frequency, and the diversity of social interactions that we have is very influential on how the virus spreads. And finally, slightly less relevant to the virus, I guess, is there are certain attributes or characteristic of the virus which make it so infectious. Its ability to persist and survive, its ability to evade our immune system when it infects the body, and so on. But these four basic mechanisms, heterogeneity, interpersonal transmission, social networks, and attributes, are really very similar to the mechanisms underlying the diffusion of low carbon innovations. So when it comes to innovations, we also know that people are different, and we have varying appetites for taking on new things. We have various aversions to uncertainty and risk, and our personal situations vary, and all of this shapes our propensity to adopt new innovations. We know that interpersonal transmission is critical. In this case, we're exchanging information and our experiences about using innovation through social contacts. We know that social networks are also important in similar ways that they are for the virus transmission, but obviously in the opposite direction. And also there's lots of research about the attributes of an innovation which make it appealing or sticky. And I'll come to all of these through the talk. Okay, so that's just the sort of the brief background, if you like, and how I think it is that we've all probably know more than we wanted to about how new things spread because of all the sort of media coverage and insight about the virus, which we've all been watching in the last 6 to 9 months. But I want to sort of turn from that to focus on a more positive side to the diffusion story, which is thinking about how do good things spread, how do things which we want more of spread. In this case, these digital low carbon innovations. So this is very much a team effort. There's a team of us at the Tyndall Centre at the University of East Anglia who've been working on this, and I think some of them are also listening in on this call. So it's myself, Hazel and Barnaby, who have been working particularly looking broadly across lots of different innovations, the kind of innovations I introduced at the beginning. And we've been trying to see if there are any generalizable insights by looking broadly across innovations in mobility, food, homes, and energy domains. But also part of the team, Emma, Laurie, and Mark, who've all been doing really interesting case study work, so looking kind of more deeply into particular innovations. So, for example, Emily's been working on smart home technologies, and I'll share some of her results a little bit later. We've been collecting lots of data in different ways, but the main data resource I'm going to draw on in this talk is what in the project we've rather unimaginatively called Big Survey, because it went out to 3,000 people in the UK about this time last year, and 3,000 people in Canada at the same time. We're actually now just doing a second wave of the survey, but I'll talk about the results from our analysis of the UK data sets from last year. So the main thing to say about the survey, this big survey, was that it had a very specific sampling design where we set quotas of 100 adopters and 100 non-adopters for each of the innovations which we were interested in. So those are shown all the way along the bottom of the screen, and they're also shown from bottom to top as you go up this graph. So what we wanted is we wanted to sample the population in the UK of adults and try and find 100 adopters and pair them with 100 non-adopters who had heard of the innovation, were familiar with it, but hadn't used it. So you can see in this graph that we managed that with many or most, many if not most of our innovations. We got up to 100. So the dark green bars on the left are the sizes of our adopter samples. and the dark grey bars on the right are the sizes of our non-adopter samples. However, we failed with respect to the energy innovation, so particularly peer-to-peer electricity trading and electric vehicle to grid. And those of you, familiar with this will not be surprised, because there are very few actual users in the UK, and so we weren't able to find them. They were too new. So we had to discount those from our analysis. Okay, so let's start with the first of these mechanisms of innovation diffusion, this basic idea of heterogeneity. Now, this is kind of one of the most famous images or graphics to come out of diffusion research. This idea that you can segment a population of adopters into different types, and essentially what the x-axis is showing the propensity to adopt new innovations, which is similar to saying your propensity to accept or take on new risk, novelty and uncertainty. So on the left, you have the innovators who kind of jump in feet first and always go for the new things. You then move through the early adopters into the mainstream market, and then at the end, the laggards who will always be last in. And essentially, if you kind of integrate under that curve as people adopt, you get this characteristic S curve, which is the overall diffusion curve or growth curve as adoption moves through a population. So what we did with our survey data is we looked to see whether there was any heterogeneity or difference between adopters and non-adopters. And we were particularly interested in differences which were consistent right across this very diverse range of digital consumer innovations. So the easiest place to start was with the socio-demographics. So we looked at, as you can see on the left, we looked at gender, age, education, employment, household income, household finances, whether people see their finances as being okay, household size, and household life cycle. And for each of these, what we did is we built, actually my colleague Barnaby, who I think is on the call, built logistic models, which are essentially models which try and predict whether someone is more likely to be an adopter or a non-adopter based on their characteristics. And the coefficients of these models are expressed in terms of odds ratios. So what this means is where you see a number that's larger than 1, it means people with that characteristic are more likely to be an adopter. And if you see a number less than 1, it means the opposite. People with that characteristic are less likely to be an adopter. But don't fear if this is not familiar terrain for you. The only thing really you need to look at is the color of the cell. So I've colored all of the positive and significant relationships are green, and I've colored all of the negative and significant relationships in orange. And that's really all you need to know to interpret these results. So if you look at these results for car clubs, you'll see that the age characteristic is negatively associated with adoption, and that's because we measured over 45. So what that means is younger people are more likely to be car club adopters. And with education and employment, we see that people with more education or more employment are more likely to be adopters. So that's the interpretation which I've summarized at the bottom of the screen. Now I'm about to show you the results for all of the innovations side by side by side, along with the exhortation that you please don't look down. In other words, there's a lot of information on this slide, and you may be, looking at your favorite innovation and looking down the column to see what explains adopters of that innovation. But was not really the purpose of this talk, and it's not really wasn't the purpose of our analysis either. I want you to look across the rows at the characteristics which are significantly associated with adoption on multiple innovations. In other words, there's a sort of general story about digital consumer innovations which can be told from these characteristics. And to make this simple, I've pointed to the 4 rows along with a star which you should look at, because these are the rows where you see this kind of consistent effect across 3, 4, 5, 6 or more of these innovations. So we see that younger people are more likely to be adopters. We see that people in employment are more likely to be adopters. we see generally that people who don't have low incomes, so people with higher incomes, are more likely to be adopters, and also people who live in multi-person households are more likely to be adopters. Now, this is all pretty intuitive and basic stuff that's very consistent with what we know from diffusion theory about the sort of classic early adopter, but I wanted to start there in a familiar place. So we also looked at many other ways in which people may be heterogeneous in terms of their adoption propensities. So down the left here, you see some other adopter characteristics. So you see at the top, 4 different types of values. So this is using a very well-known value scale developed by a guy called Schwartz back in the 70s, which distinguishes people who have values related to openness to change, people with values related to self-transcendence. So this is often associated with sort of biospheric or planetary or altruistic outlooks. Values associated with self-enhancement. This is more related to authority, leadership, and material comfort. And values that are more traditional, relating to, for example, safety, security, family, and so on. If you carry on looking down the left, we also looked at digital skills. So the skills that people demonstrated in their use of digital apps in particular. We looked at 2 different types of lifestyle activities. These were concepts developed by a colleague of ours in Canada, John Axon, who looked at people who do a lot of sort of environmental stuff. So they might think, discuss, act, and get involved in stuff to do with the environment, and also people who have technological lifestyles. So these are people who, think, discuss, shop, tinker with, and use lots of different technologies. And then finally, we looked at personality. So these are the big 5 personality traits: neuroticism, openness, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So as before, I'll show you the results from, even though I'm exhorting you not to look down a column, I'll show you the results for car clubs just to get you in the picture. So we see from these results that adopters of car clubs are more open to change in terms of their value system. They're more digitally skillful, and they're more technologically active in their lifestyles. And then there's slightly odd result that they seem to be unconscientious, but I think that's probably a bit of noise. So if I now show you the results for the whole set of innovations, again, try and avoid scanning down any particular column, rather look across, and you see that the 3 rows that I've highlighted with the black arrows are the ones which tend to have these effects across, again, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more of the innovations in our sample. So we see that adopters are more digitally skillful, they're more environmentally active as part of their lifestyle, and they're more technologically active as well. Now, this leads on nicely to a bit of additional analysis we did, looking at heterogeneity within the adopters. So all the stuff I've shown you so far has been looking at differences between adopters and non-adopters. This is now looking at differences within the adopters themselves. So we did a simple clustering analysis where we took 2 variables, self-transcendence values and self-enhancement values. So remember that self-transcendence values are these kinds of planetary biospheric values, and self-enhancement values are more about kind of, my leadership, my role, and my material comfort. And we use cluster analysis, which is a simple way of essentially finding groups or clusters within the data who have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics from everybody else. So you try and create a small number of clusters or groups which are nicely defined as being different from other clusters or groups. So you see that on these 2 plots, we have a group in blue which have low self-transcendence values but higher self-enhancement values. We have a group in green which have the opposite. They have high self-transcendence values and low self-enhancement values. And then we have this group in yellow which do well on both. And if you then use those same 3 clusters and test for differences on other stuff, you start building up a picture about who people in that cluster are. So we looked, as you can see, at digital skills. We looked at something called domain innovativeness, which is the role that people play as innovators within a given consumption domain. So, for example, within the transport domain or within the food domain and so on. We looked at other values like openness to change, and we looked at these lifestyle activities. And the places where we found significant differences between these clusters are shown with those stars in the figure, in the labels for each row. So you can see that domain innovativeness, the lifestyles, both environmental activities and technological activities, were significantly different between these three clusters. And so, putting it simply, these three clusters are shown now on the left in terms of their relative proportion within the overall group of adopters. We found the biggest group were innovators who just score highly on everything. We found also quite a large group of more technologically minded early adopters who tend to have more egoistic values and technological lifestyles. And then a smaller but non-trivial group of environmental early adopters with biospheric values and environmental lifestyles. So all of this, to sort of summarize, all of this shows, yes, we find strong heterogeneity both between adopters and non-adopters and within adopters themselves when you're looking at this range of digital consumer innovations. Okay, so on to the second mechanism, which I mentioned earlier, interpersonal transmission. And this is really the heart of diffusion theory. And there are four distinct but related types of social influence or mechanisms by which information spreads from person to person. The most obvious is called word of mouth, or WOM as it's nicely known, or certainly for anyone my age or older who remembers the Wombles, it always makes me smile. But also EWOM, which is obviously a more recent development, which is electronic word of mouth, and particularly related to our use of social media and communication online. This doesn't feature very strongly in the seminal work on diffusion of innovations because the last edition of that book was published in 2003. So it's been a sort of field of more active research since. The third and the fourth mechanisms of social influence are slightly more diffuse, neighborhood effects or peer effects by which you observe activity around you in your locality or your neighborhood, and it has an indirect influence on your own thinking. And social norms, i.e. your awareness of what others consider to be normal, common, but also acceptable and approved, and how you internalize in your own decision making. So with a colleague, Hazel Pettifor, we looked at this a few years ago where we looked at studies of social influence on electric vehicle adoption. And we found that actually all four mechanisms had a significant effect, but they were fairly similar in their sizes or magnitudes. So in this more recent work, we bundled these together into a social influence variable. And as I showed you before, we tested to see whether that variable, as well as other variables relating to information flows, could explain or could predict whether someone would be an adopter or a non-adopter. So on the left, you see these variables, domain innovativeness, which I mentioned. It's a measure of how much of a sort of opinion leader you are within a given domain, transport, food, homes, etc. So an opinion leader would be someone who would probably be early to try out new things and would be ready to communicate and spread information about those new things. The social influence I've just discussed. And then we also talked about, we also measured two of the opposite, information sources which people might actively go after in order to shape their opinion. And we distinguished the interpersonal sources. I might actively go and talk to my colleagues at work to find stuff out, or I might actively use mass media or internet search to find stuff out. So we tested these variables to see if they could explain adoption. And as before, here are the results for car clubs, just to illustrate. We found the first two variables were strongly significant. So adopters of car clubs are more innovative when it comes to transport innovations. And they also receive more information through these interpersonal information flows about car clubs. But interestingly, they don't differ in those bottom two variables. So they don't differ in how they actively seek information to shape their opinion. So this already tells you that the social influence processes we're interested in are useful and relevant for predicting whether someone will adopt or not. And if you then see the results for all the innovations side by side, again, if you look across the rows, you see that those first two, how innovative people consider themselves to be, and the extent to which they receive or are exposed to consistently explains their adoption. So we can't infer causality from this survey data because it's a cross-sectional piece of research, but this is kind of strong evidence that would be consistent with a causal interpretation that social influence helps lead to adoption. That was looking at adoption versus non-adoption. We also looked at, we split the non-adopters into high propensity and low propensity adopters. So essentially by asking people, you know, are you likely to try this out or use this within the next year? We can split them into these different propensities. And again, we found that these social influence effects tended to be stronger among those who said they were planning to give it a go relatively soon compared to those who said they weren't. And in other words, this social influence effect kind of acts all the way down that sort of adopter heterogeneity chain. And this was the same for all three of our clusters that I showed you earlier among our adopters. Now, if I was in a room with you, I would pause at this point and ask you this question. Well, I'll ask it to you anyway. Which of those four social influence mechanisms do you think has the strongest effect for these digital low carbon innovations? Remember that for the electric vehicle study I showed you, we found that actually all four had a similar effect. They're all similarly strong. But do you think one of them might have a stronger effect for these innovations, which we were interested in? I won't dare to try and do this interactively using Microsoft Teams, but hopefully you've all got an answer framed in your mind's eye. We found that electronic word of mouth was actually the most significant explanation. So this is the most significant difference, the strongest and most significant difference between these cross sections of adopters, high propensity non-adopters and low propensity non-adopters. And we reasoned rather conjecturally, but we reasoned that this is to do with the fact that all of these innovations have a strong digital aspect. And so there's a sort of connection between the digital innovation and the digital means of spreading information about that innovation. That needs further research for us to confirm. Okay, so we're on to the third mechanism. So I'm just going to pause to say that Phil and I, before the call, discussed and said if anyone's got any burning questions, you just stick them in the chat and he'll relay them to me. So I'm going to plow on regardless, but obviously if you do have any burning questions that can't wait till the end, do intervene and Phil will tell me. Okay, so the third mechanism is about social networks. And there's lots of evidence from diffusion research that the size and the structure of people's social networks are influential on the communication processes, which in turn are influential on innovation adoption. And there's two characteristics in particular, homophily and transitivity, that my colleague Emily came up with these lovely visuals for representing. So on the left, you see a very homophilous bunch of Wallies who are all identical. And on the right, you see a very heterophilous bunch of Lego people who are all different. So homophily is a measure of whether people you know and interact with are the same as you. And they can be the same in terms of age, in terms of background, in terms of income, in terms of location, and so on. On the bottom, another characteristic of social networks we're interested in is called transitivity. And this is essentially a measure of how much all the people you know each other. So on the left, you see someone with high transitivity would be in a very cliquey social network whereby everyone they know knows each other. Whereas the person on the right is in the opposite. They're in a network with very low transitivity, which is not cliquey. Now, the key point about these two characteristics is that people with social networks, more like the Lego people on the right, will be exposed to a much more diverse range of information and will spread that information more widely through their social networks compared to the people on the left who all hang out with people like themselves in very cliquey groups. So we measured these and then we looked to see whether they would help explain adoption of all our digital consumer innovations. So you can see these on the left. We also measured social media intensity. So this is a measure of the number of social media platforms that people use combined with the amount of time they spend using them. So it's a rough proxy of the sort of diversity of information that people might get through social media use. And then the others of those social network variables I've explained. Strong ties and weak ties are the difference between essentially your close friends or your close contacts whose views and experiences you trust, and your more sort of distal or distant colleagues whose views and experiences are of interest to you, but you might put less weight on them. So if you look at car clubs again, we found that adopters of car clubs have more diverse online networks, which they interact with more regularly. But otherwise, we didn't find any of the social network variables helped explain adoption. And if you think about it, this is kind of obvious because we're talking about adoption of a very specific innovation, but yet we're measuring social networks which are general to a person's whole life. So you wouldn't expect there to be a strong relationship. And indeed, when you look at all of the innovations side by side, this is exactly what you find. This social media intensity that's a sort of crude proxy of the diversity of people's online networks is a very strong and relevant predictor across the board, but otherwise you just have a few little patches where social networks are relevant. So in other words, you need to map information flows specific to an innovation through social networks to see this social network effect. And this is what my colleague Emily did in a study where she went into sort of more depth with adopters and non-adopters of smart home technologies and was able to do some simple social network mapping with them. So this is a little screenshot where you can see people can say 5 of their close friends who they talk to regularly, and then show the connections between them to measure transitivity and homophily and other questions. And what Emily found was, again, consistent with diffusion theory, that adopters compared to non-adopters are more actively seeking information from more diverse sources, and they're more likely to act as opinion leaders in shaping and communicating information about those innovations. So this is the role that adopters play in the diffusion process. But she also found some interesting evidence suggesting that adopters, when it comes to smart home tech and who they talk to about smart tech, are quite cliquey and also to some extent have homophilous social contacts. In other words, people like them, particularly when it comes to income. Non-adopters, by comparison, as you'd expect in diffusion theory, have their opinions shaped by their social contacts whose views they trust, but in this case, we're 3 times less likely to know anyone with any smart tech compared to the adopters. And so our kind of interpretation of these results was that there's a bit of a barrier here, whereby adopters who are playing their roles in social networks, communicating their experiences, which by the way, of these smart techs were generally very positive, but they're only communicating them to like-minded souls in similar networks, and so the information is not diffusing out more widely. And this is one possible reason why smart tech diffusion seems to be slowing or have slowed. Okay, the final mechanism relating to innovation diffusion I want to talk about is the attributes, and I'm going to talk briefly about these. But diffusion theory is very clear that certain attributes or characteristics of an innovation make it more or less appealing. And Rogers, in his work, summarized these as relative advantage, ease of use, compatibility, trialability, which is can you give it a go before committing, and observability, can you see others doing it before committing. And we found when we did our logistic modeling, we found that relative advantage, ease of use and compatibility were consistently perceived to be more appealing or stronger for innovations among the adopters compared to the non-adopters. Again, this is exactly what you'd expect. We didn't find significant effects really for trialability and observability. And interestingly, we didn't find significant differences for climate benefits. In other words, innovations are not are not more likely to see stronger climate benefits than the non-adopters. So this doesn't help us explain why they've adopted. And we went a little bit further here. Well, we've done lots more analysis actually of attributes, but one little bit I wanted to share was we sort of asked the question, well, hold on, we've got lots of variability or variation in our different innovations. Some have very high ease of use, some are quite complex, some are trialable before committing, others aren't. Can we link specific attributes to specific social influence processes? So for example, I've drawn this dotted arrow between compatibility and social norms. So you could reason that innovations which are less compatible with your daily lifestyle or your values might need you to have been exposed to stronger social norms which communicate to you that these things are normal and therefore compatible with people's lifestyles. As another kind of conjecture, we reason that innovations which have low observability, so think about the kind of smart technologies in homes where you don't really observe or see these being used, they might require stronger electronic word of mouth, stronger kind of affirmation through online social media that these things are, you know, great or have good benefits or whatever. So we tested these relationships to see, and somewhat disappointingly, we didn't find any specific links between innovations with certain attributes and certain social influence processes. Okay, so I want to summarize the sort of key insights that I've shared with you. So when it comes to heterogeneity, and remember that I'm talking about a wide set of digital low carbon innovations and trying to make some generalizable assertions right across the board. So we see that people are different. We see that adopters are different from non-adopters, and we see that adopters themselves are differentiated into these different clusters. With respect to transmission mechanisms, we find, or we confirm, that social influence is indeed strongly a strong and significant predictor of adoption right across the board. And this is particularly the case for electronic word of mouth as well as the other mechanisms. When it comes to social networks, we don't find that at the level of specific innovation adoption, social networks differ, but we do find from the smart home tech case study that there's issues potentially with the flow of information from adopter cliques into wider social processes. And when it comes to attributes, we see that adopters perceive innovations to be more beneficial and more appealing in lots of ways. And there's lots more work, in particular, my colleague Hazel has done, looking at how the sort of what's called the non-core or the sort of value-added attributes of these low carbon innovations really help differentiate the appeal of them from mainstream consumption practices. Okay, so just very briefly, I want to sort of end by talking about the sort of so what. So what are the implications of all this? Well, the mechanisms of diffusion, which I've just been through, just as the mechanisms of virus transmission, which there are these analogies between these different mechanisms, they determine outcomes, in particular growth rates. So we've seen these, I've shown you these S-curves with respect to innovation diffusion. And again, very sadly, we've been seeing these similar kind of S-curves when it comes to the virus transmission. So these sort of slow build up and then this tipping point where you go through this rapid exponential growth phase before things can be got under control. And again, the underlying mechanisms between these two growth processes are similar. And this also then points to analogies between the kinds of control measures by which you'd be trying to obviously slow or stop these growth rates when it comes to the virus. And obviously subject to it being safe to do so, you might be trying to look to speed up the diffusion process for these digital low carbon innovations. So I've just given some examples there in this table relating to each of those four mechanisms. We know that people are different, that heterogeneity matters. In the case of the virus, you want to isolate the spreaders, protect the vulnerable. And in the case of digital innovations where you might be trying to speed them up to harness the climate benefits, you actively might be trying to recruit opinion leaders and incentivize early adopters to start spreading information and experiences through their social networks. And so on. I mean, you can see the other sorts of examples that I've suggested on this slide. And these control measures for trying to speed up the spread of digital consumer innovations are important because social influence can help accelerate adoption through a population of adopters. And so if there are these climate benefits, can help drive progress towards net zero. And just to end with, I want to give you one example of where we tried to look at the impact of this. This was in a study a couple of years ago with colleagues in the Netherlands who have a big global model called Image. And we looked at some scenarios in which warming is limited to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures. And we looked at electric vehicles in particular, where we had one scenario where we assume you only learn technologically, so you can learn how to reduce costs and improve performance. This is very common in the sort of modeling world. But we also included what we called social learning. So this is where you learn about an innovation, communicate the benefits of that innovation through a population, and reduce perceived risk. This is a sort of non-tangible cost to adoption. And you can see the graph on the left, which is the technological learning only, the middle graph, which is the social learning only, then combine into the graph on the right, which shows that in this case, the diffusion of electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles is higher if you include both these types of learning. So this accelerated diffusion, I think, can be critical in the efforts to tackle climate change. So with that, I will stop. You've all been very quiet in not interrupting, which is very nice of you, but I hope that means you haven't all nodded off. And I'm going to close my screen, stop screen sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlie. That was absolutely fascinating. I believe we don't have more questions because people were just like me, spellbound, listening to you every word. I've got heaps of questions. So anybody who's got questions, this is your time to put them in the chat, and then we can go through them, and you can turn on your camera and microphone and ask Charlie directly whatever you wish to know. I've got one question that I just can't wait because I fear I might not like the answer. We've seen that heterogeneity is quite important. And I kept thinking that for some of these innovations, you need rather wealthy people. You know, the early adopters, they need to have the first Teslas at high cost and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I rather am a believer in more income equality. Is there a case for having high inequality in society to drive these innovations? I'm thinking of royal families leading to Christmas trees everywhere. And
yeah, it's a great question. There clearly are regressive implications of high capital cost innovations, which, you know, to the extent they're beneficial, would initially benefit the wealthier before, you know, the sort of the learning cycle begins and the costs start to come down and they become more affordable. It's probably worth saying in our sample, probably about half are service-based innovations for which there aren't prohibitive upfront costs. And in some cases, if not many cases, the innovations themselves are net money savers to the extent, you know, once you're committed and involved. And actually, there's one, having told you not to look down at any specific innovation, I remember that 11th hour food apps, the food sharing apps, are actually more commonly used by lower income households as ways of accessing surplus food. That's not to say that these regressive effects or this issue of equity isn't important. It's a classic problem with kind of the early adopter sort of niche. But it creates for me, a very interesting tension from a policy perspective between wanting to target early adopters with incentives. You see this with electric vehicles, the example you gave. You start seeding both the technological learning process, but also the social learning process. The information spreads, people get more comfortable with EV risks and uncertainties, become more likely to adopt, and then the virtuous process continues. So you ultimately end up with a more socially beneficial outcome, having begun with a less equitable beginning. And it's a very tricky one from a policy perspective.
But that was a reassuring answer. Thank you so much, Charlie. So we've got a few questions in the chat, and I'll literally go through them in order and ask you to ask it yourself. So the first one is from Daniel about the role of families. Daniel, do you want to ask Charlie? Just turn on your microphone and camera.
Do I have to? You want to see me as well? Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
You can now probably see me as well. Yeah, most of the research seems to talk about individuals. Almost all the consumption that I carry out, and I don't think I'm very different. As a household, well, I'm a family, but there are also households doing it. And there seems to be two alternatives. One is that could be a break, so it's the lowest common denominator, the person who's most conservative. And it could be the other way, that perhaps a kid comes home from school with a bright idea, and the parents respect the kid and love the kid and do as it's called pester power. And it seems to be a really important thing to research as to how family dynamics affect consumption that affects climate change. I should say a little bit of plug. I did set up a website, familyclimateemergency.net, and I've had very little response in terms of emails to that. And I've got very little response within my family to show that, that we, although we've all declared an emergency, are actually progressing. I think COVID has got a lot to do with it, because we've done it automatically, so we don't have a natural level playing field. But I'd like to hear your views on how families constrain or encourage.
Yeah, again, it's a great question. So in the logistic models that I was showing you the results of, where we were trying to explain whether someone would be an adopter or non-adopter based on their characteristics, we did include there was a lot I didn't show you, but we did include various household level controls to do with, for example, household size, home ownership or rental, home location, commute times, like lots of things to do with travel, food and homes, which try and approximate certain characteristics of the household, given that we were asking questions of individuals. And we found, with a few exceptions, that they weren't significant. So in other words, the simplistic explanation is that once you've captured all these main effects of individual values, social influence, social networks, etc., the household level variables don't seem to constrain or explain more. We also measured, we also measured whether the individual who we were asking questions of was the main or joint decision maker with respect to, let's say, buying food or traveling around in their household. And again, we didn't find that was a significant moderating effect on the results. However, in other work that I've done on smart home technologies from a few years back, we looked specifically at household dynamics and found that, yes, you're absolutely right. How smart heating systems in this case were domesticated and used within the rhythms of a household was both defined or influenced by household dynamics, who had responsibility for doing what and in what way, but also it impacted household dynamics. And actually, my colleague Tom Hargreaves at UEA has written a really nice paper that came out this year in Nature Energy, really exploring this issue of household dynamics and the particular issue of smart homes.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next question we've got from Pietro. Do you want to?
Yeah, hi, Charlie. I really like your talk. I'm from the technical side. I work in renewable energies. And I wonder, when you think you can save energy with that or greenhouse gases, what about the rebound effects? For example, the example of a family of lower income does this food sharing and ride sharing to actually go on a holiday by plane because this is what's considered good in their surroundings. So all these kind of influences eventually bind us that we don't save as much energy as we may imagine.
Yeah. So I can't see if Nick Ayres still on the call, but I hope I would be echoing or parroting Nick by saying that rebound effects, which are welfare enhancing, are good things But I absolutely recognize that rebound effects, even if they do improve welfare and well-being, might offset some, or extreme cases, all of the climate benefits. So what I didn't show was the results of a big kind of literature survey that we did, looking at studies which had measured the impact on energy use or emissions from using each of the innovations that I have been talking about. And we found very, very consistent evidence that all these innovations could potentially reduce energy or carbon emissions. And in a few cases, you're absolutely right, there were these rebound effects which offset some, and in really extreme cases, all of the savings. But they were the exceptions rather than the rules. The other, in fact, the more important effect was the substitution effect. So if I use an e-bike, an electric bike, and I used to use a car or a motorbike, and I substitute that with an e-bike, I have net emission savings. But if I used to walk or bicycle and I move and use an e-bike, I have net emission additions. So that substitution effect could also offset some, and extreme cases, all of the emission reduction benefits. But generally speaking, the evidence was strongly in favor of emission reductions. And the paper that I referenced in the talk has all of the graphs and the data if you want to look at that further, or I'm happy to send it to you.
Thank you. That sounds good, but I still think you are looking at a certain narrow area of what people do. They may compensate, and the rebound effects may occur outside of what you actually look at.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. No, and I totally get you. I mean, the studies which we reviewed, which quantified rebound effects, looked both at the direct rebound. So, smart heating has reduced my energy bills, so I use more heat, but also the indirect rebound. Smart heating has reduced my energy bills, so I fly on holiday with all the money I've saved.
Okay.
So they looked at both of those, and there's a lot of empirical research on rebound, which I mean, I don't want to be too simplistic about summarizing it, but ballpark 10, 20, maybe up to 40% of the energy savings may be taken back in rebound effects, but not the whole effect. And again, to the extent that that rebound is welfare enhancing, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear.
As it happens, our next question is from the very Nick Eyre you mentioned, Charlie. So
I hope he's not going to tell me I was completely misrepresenting his views.
No, you accurately represented my views, Charlie, but not necessarily other people's, I suppose. I just wanted to ask you about saturation levels, because you focus quite a bit on the early dynamics and speed of diffusion, which is obviously important, but the eventual climate effect of these innovations will depend on the saturation level as well. Is there anything you can get from these sorts of studies that might help you forecast what the saturation level is going to be? Because that would be immensely useful.
Yes, well, so yes, there is. So what, and in fact, so some of the results I was showing you in the talk are very kind of hot off the press. We're working on them. We've been working on them a lot in the last few weeks. But one of the things we want to do, so you recall that I showed you for the adopters, these three clusters, the sort of classic innovators, and then these more kind of techie adopters and the more environmental adopters. So we found that those same three clusters, the same basic distinctions, also hold in the high propensity non-adopters and the low propensity non-adopters. So consider this, if you like, adopters, mass market, laggards. They each of them have this sort of division between the sort of the more innovator type. Well, sorry, that's less relevant. They have this division between people who are more tech oriented and people who are more environmentally oriented. And so we're going to use that as a very simple sort of diffusion life cycle, that if these innovations appeal consistently to these people with more tech lifestyles or lifestyle orientations, and if they then receive appropriate social influence and costs come down, etc., then you could propagate diffusion through that sort of cross section, if you like, and ditto the environmental cross section and ditto the other one. And so it gives us a very, very simple diffusion model where we can test the implications of saturation at different levels through those different clusters. And that's exactly what we're about to start doing.
Great. So it was a good question.
It's a great question, and I just can't give you the answer yet. But invite me back in a year, as the saying goes, and I'll.
Yeah, if you have any more great questions, put them in the chat, or I'm sure you can probably email Charlie as well. That was a wonderful talk, and in the spirit of having fantastic speakers, we'll have another one next week. It's Julia Davenport, the CEO of Good Energy, and she'll talk about the road to net zero. So that'll be another opportunity for us to live up to Charlie's data and spread innovation by having a heterogeneous group of people participating and spreading the word. In fact, it did make me worry, the contrast you'd shown between corona responses and innovation, that actually lockdown might inhibit innovation. I don't know, do you feel like we might see a slowdown in innovation because of what we're going through?
I mean, there's just, I mean, I know it's past 5, and if anyone like me wants to go to the pub while we're still allowed to go to the pub, I won't go on for long. But there is some evidence for, my colleague Emily found some nice evidence from some survey data in France that confirms the intuition that our social networks have really shrunken and sort of rigidified or ossified into their pre-lockdown state. In other words, we talk more to people we already talked a lot with, but we have much fewer diverse kind of interactions where we might hear about odd stuff willy-nilly. And it's that latter in exchange, the unexpected and diverse sources of information exchange, which are critical for driving diffusion. So conjecturally, yes, I would agree with you. I think all of what's happened in the last 6 to 9 months probably have slowed rates of innovation. That's obviously offset by this very strong digitalization imperative, also as a result of lockdown, as we are currently experiencing on Microsoft Teams.
Well, on this upbeat note, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Great pleasure.
It's been fantastic. Thank you, Charlie. And please join us again next week for another chance to foster that serendipity of innovation and ideas.
Bye.
Goodbye.